I am recording. Hello, everybody on YouTube. Let me get my Bible.
Okay, welcome. We have a small group here, and hopefully other people will be joining us on YouTube. This is the beginning of a series of lectures and discussions entitled "By the Waters of Babylon," which is a study of the Jewish exile period. And so we'll be discussing during the next this week and during the next 3 weeks, various aspects of the exile. And so next week we'll be looking at various attempts of renewal of the religious life of the Jewish people. Then the following week, talking about a development of a new way of looking at the covenant. And then finally, the final week, we'll be talking about the return from the exile. So today, there's really three things I want to talk about. I'm not sure we're going to get into the third one all that much. But first, I want to talk about the geopolitical background of the exile, and then talk something about the exile itself, the history and some aspects of it. And then finally, just to look at what were the Jewish options during the exile? What were the possibility ways of responding to it? So, our theme, if you will, if I can get myself here, I always have to find that stop share button. Okay. Our theme, if you will, is taken from the 137th Psalm, which was probably written very, very shortly after the beginning of the exile. And it reads, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat weeping when we remembered Zion. On the poplars in its midst, we hung up our harps. For there our captors asked us for the words of a song, our tormentors for joy. Sing for us a song of Zion. But how could we sing a song of the Lord in a foreign land? So I want to begin by talking about what I would call the geopolitical setting of this, and show you a map, which I think is familiar probably ever since fourth grade or so. This is what historians have come to call the Fertile Crescent. And it's the area where civilization began in the near Mid-East. And it really is kind of a crescent shape. Um, as far as time is concerned, we're beginning about 10,000 years ago, when this area first became settled and civilization began to develop. You can see the crescent extends from, in the lower left-hand corner, Egypt all the way down to the Persian Gulf. And it includes today's present countries, several countries: Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, parts of Turkey, parts of Iran, and parts of Arabia. And the boundaries of this Fertile Crescent, to the north and the northwest, are the Taurus Mountains in Turkey. To the north and the northeast are the Zagros Mountains. And then making this into a crescent is the Arabian Desert, which of course is an immense area of sand. What is interesting to note about the Fertile Crescent is that while the development of civilization or urban development took place in all of this area. It did not happen at a constant rate or even at a uniform rate. Um, and so the two ends of the crescent, Egypt and the area near the Persian Gulf, are the areas that saw the most rapid growth and also the most advanced growth of urbanization. Egypt, by the way, is not really part of our story, and so I'm not going to talk about it much about that. We'll be referencing Egypt once in a while. In this area, there were basically three stages of development. Once we had moved beyond the hunter and gatherer stage, and the people were actually using methods of agriculture and raising and breeding of herds of cattle and other animals. So the three stages, the first stage was to develop the development of farming villages. And these are small, very small towns, probably a dozen families or so. And there were literally hundreds of these throughout the area. Later on, there developed some smaller cities. And by a small city, we do mean a small city, probably 1,000 people or so. And then out of some of those smaller cities, depending on location primarily, there developed some large urban centers. Um, Now, it is interesting that what we call Canaan or today Israel, Palestine, did not move much beyond that second stage of the small cities, the small villages. Um, the only large city that was developed in this period was probably Jericho. Jerusalem was really not on the map at all at that point. Um, and these centers developed because of location, and the two primary things being the ability to connect with water, either rivers or lakes or seas, um, or the other thing might be because they were on trade routes, and there were major trade routes crisscrossing this Fertile Crescent. Some ran north to south, some are east to west, some northwest to southeast. So we have, and then we do have later on certain cities that have developed because they were on high places, either mountainsides or bluffs of some kind. And Jerusalem does fall into that category. But again, that comes much, much later, um, almost 2,000 years after the development of cities in Assyria and Babylonia, you finally have Jerusalem emerging as a city. So the area at the southeast corner of this Fertile Crescent was populated by a people called the Sumerians. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Sumerians. By the way, jump in if you have any questions. So the question is, who were these Sumerians? And the answer is, we really don't know. Um, um, they, according to their myths and legends, they came up the Persian Gulf, but we have no idea where in the Persian Gulf they came from, if that story is indeed true. They had a language which has been pretty much thoroughly interpreted and translated, but the language doesn't resemble any other language known on Earth. And so they are kind of a mystery people. But they landed in this area that you can see on the map as Sumer. They landed there about 7,000 BCE. We don't have much of a history from that period because writing did not happen until about 3,000 BCE. But they're an interesting people, these Sumerians, fascinating in many ways. Among the things that they gave us and they developed was the wheel, writing, the concept of irrigation and hydraulic engineering, accounting systems, Time, the system that we use for hours, minutes, seconds, that came from the Sumerians. They developed bureaucracy, which may or may not be a good thing. But they also developed methods of storing up surplus food supplies. And to protect those food supplies, they developed a security force. And that security force eventually became a standing army. And the standing army, of course, meant once you had an army, you could use it. And so they invented war.
Oh.
Now, the Egyptians invented many of these same things at the same time, but they didn't really correspond. They didn't really connect with each other at this point. So it's kind of independent developments. And
Couldn't you
then,
say that because they became agricultural and had some land to defend and not hunter-gatherers, that the necessity of war um, revealed itself rather than just like, let's do something fun, go kill people. Yeah.
I'm
Um,
sorry, Pastor, what was the last thing?
not that they invented war for the sport of it,
Oh,
but
no,
but
I'm sure it was not for the sport of it. I mean, almost everything seems to have some kind of an economic impetus. And it
Mhm.
was to protect their supplies of food and their waterways and their irrigation canals. Um, and it's just basically to keep the economy going. And that meant that sometimes you had either other city states that became troublesome and they wanted to take over your territory or your flocks or your land. And so you had to fight them. You also had the problem. I know I have said many times that if you want to put the entire history of the world, human history, into two words, those two words are people move. And this is very true of this area. For 3,000 years, you have one group of, probably 7,000 years, you have one group of people after another moving into this area. And of course, they want to take over what you have already had. And so part of it was part of the development of a military and of a war process was to defend yourselves against invaders. And it so happens in Mesopotamia, um, which is kind of a catch-all of Assyria, Babylonia, and a few other areas. In Mesopotamia, you had people charging in from the north and from the south, both. And we'll see a little bit about that later on. Now, I want to say a little bit about writing because I find this very fascinating. This is one of the things that the Sumerians invented and developed to a very high degree. Excuse me. I ask you just to think about if you know any little kids, the first time they start writing, they want to write on everything in sight. One thing you do not do is to put a little kid with a Sharpie in a room with blank walls. Well, the Sumerians are, in a sense, are like the children of civilization, because once they discovered writing, and it was possible to put little marks on clay and have them preserved. Once they began to write, they became obsessed with writing. And this is true really of all Mesopotamians. It's not only the early Sumerians. But when the archaeologists about 150 years ago started discovering these clay tables and started working on deciphering them, they were very excited because they thought this is going to tell us everything we want to know about this people, about their religion, about their politics, their philosophy, and so forth. And then they started translating the documents and discovered they were grocery lists, and they were inventories, and they were invoices, and they were all kinds of accounting devices. And there are clay tablets that tell what the apportionment of rations for horses was on a daily basis. Um, are even some clay tablets that tell about the number of sheep that died in various areas. And my favorite, I think, is if you look at legal documents, often there is a page that this page intentionally left blank. Know those?
Yeah.
Well, we find those in some of the Sumerian tablets. There's a tablet that says nothing happened today. Actually, there are a few tablets like that that have been found.
Would you have to be writing that when the clay is still sort of fresh and not dry, or how did?
Ye-
Yeah.
Yeah, the amazing thing about the cuneiform tablets, which eventually they developed a stylus that made it very easy to write. But as long as the clay is soft, you can make all these impressions in it, and you can make the very small impressions. So you can put an awful lot on one of these little tablets. Um, I have a tablet, a replica of one, but I'll bring it next time. But anyway, um, then if you just leave the clay tablet out in the sun or even in warm weather, it'll harden. If you want to make it really permanent, then you put it into an oven. And like I say, they created tablets about everything. Now some of them are much more intense than that. They can recount the various myths of the culture, and there are a lot of historical documents, a tremendous amount of diplomatic correspondence. Um, and they're written in a lot of different languages. Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian are the major ones, but there are probably cuneiform tablets in 40 different languages, some of which have been translated and some of which have not. And I say Sumerian has been translated, but we don't still have no idea where the language came from. Um, there is a wonderful story about William F. Albright, who was a professor at Johns Hopkins and one of the great early archaeologists. And it was said of Albright that he could walk through a field in Syria and just reach down because these tablets are everywhere, or were everywhere. Now they've probably been sold mostly to souvenir hunters. But Albright could reach down, pick up a tablet, tell you what language it was written in, and translate it on the spot.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, it is now estimated that in various libraries and museums around the world, there are approximately 500,000 of these cuneiform tablets. And many of them are still waiting to be translated and interpreted. The town of Ebla, which was uncovered, about 40 years ago or so. They figure it's still probably going to take another 15 years to finish translating everything they found there. And they keep finding, even during the wars in Iraq, they keep finding new deposits of these tablets. Anyway, that's about writing, which I say I find a fascinating subject. But what we have in this Fertile Crescent, and particularly in the area of Mesopotamia, which is the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, is the succession of various empires, if we want to call it that, though some of them were not very big. But each of them was centered around a particular city. And in the case of some of the cities, there were multiple empires over the years. Babylon, for instance, had several different ones. Um, but most of these empires did not last a long time. Probably the average age was a little over 100 years. The one exception to this is the Assyrian Empire, which lasted over 600 years. And the Assyrian Empire, therefore, kind of sets the standard for society, for culture, just for trade, commerce, and all kinds of other aspects of civilization. The Assyrians were extremely well organized. Again, one might say almost compulsively or obsessively organized. Um, they divided their territory into various districts and placed governors over them. The governors were responsible to the king or the emperor of the Assyrian Empire. They developed a postal system, which was a marvel for its time. The Persians took it and kind of improved a little bit upon it, but either Assyrian or Persian is probably better than any postal system we have in the world today.
Hmm.
They developed some interesting offices. One I find particularly fascinating is the Inspector General,
Hmm.
who is a person who is responsible either to the council or to the emperor and goes around checking and make sure that all of the various officials of the empire are acting in a proper way. And there were a lot of inspectors general in the Assyrian Empire. The emperor developed a secret police, very similar to, I guess, what we would call the FBI or maybe the KGB, I'm not sure. Um, but through this, he was able to enforce his will upon all the different territories that he controlled. Um, Again, the core motivation of building an empire and maintaining an empire is wealth. Trade and commerce are what drives the entire process. Very little of this. We are big and mighty Assyrians, and we're going to show you how big and great we are. That wasn't part of the game. The game was to make as much money as you could without disrupting the lives of the people. So the trade and commerce of the Assyrian Empire went far beyond the boundaries of the empire and included today's Greece, Egypt, Armenia, Ethiopia, India, and there is even some hint that there may have been trade with China. So it was a very, and the trade within the empire, of course, was extremely extensive and intensive. Now, to manage an empire, and in this case, um, virtually everything except Egypt that is on this map um, was part of the Assyrian Empire. Um, Egypt was not, but at one point, the Egyptians ticked off the Assyrians, and so they marched in and took it over too. But that was only for a brief time. Now, to manage this empire, historians have established that there were probably 4 different stages at which various countries or city-states uh, uh, related to the empire as a whole. And the first stage would have been what we call amity. Um, the empire sent ambassadors to the city-state. They sent ambassadors back to the capital. There were trade agreements, um, taxation, um, generally flowed from the small states to the capital. Um, but the local government pretty much retained its control. The royal families, so the local kings and princes, usually remained in power. So that was the first stage, and that's the way the Assyrians preferred to have things. And they made those kind of agreements with, again, with dozens, if probably not hundreds, but certainly dozens of other city-states. The second level, however, was if that first level didn't work out, you went to the second level, and that was submission. And under that plan, the emperor would appoint a governor. Again, it might be a local person, it might be somebody from Assyria, and a garrison was set up with troops. Again, probably a mixture of local constabulary and the army from the Assyrians. In this case, taxation was usually increased to cover the cost of the bureaucracy and the garrisons and that went again to the capital. Well, if that didn't work, if you had people grumbling and creating trouble, interfering with trade, then you went to the next stage, which was intervention. And that's when heads would roll. Whoever was in charge of the local government probably was executed. Um, a standing army was put in place, and a new set of governors and officials was appointed. Now, if that didn't work, then you went to the fourth stage. And the fourth stage was basically, for the Assyrians, was annihilation. It meant you exiled all of the people down to the local lowest farmers. You exiled everybody, put them in a different part of the empire. You brought in people from somewhere else to take over the land, and everything was run by the central government. Now, again, the Assyrian Empire tried to do things if they could at the first level. If they had to go to the second, they were not happy about that. If they had to go to the third, they really were not happy. And the fourth was done only in extreme cases. But you can see, if you look at the story of the northern tribes of Israel, this is exactly what happened. They went through the first, second, third, and finally the fourth stage came, and the Assyrians had had enough of this. And so they simply took everybody off the land and sent them away to various places. I think I've got a slide on that. This is not a terribly good slide, but it does show the purple lines show the fact that Israel was taken by the Syrians and moved into various parts of Assyria. We don't really know where. There is some speculation, again, mostly on legend, that some of the Israelites ended up in what is now Afghanistan. Others have them in parts of Persia and Elam. Um, there's also one tradition that says they ended up down at the very um, head of the Persian Gulf, at the outlet of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The people that came into Israel, again, we have no idea where they came from, but some were in the Assyrian Empire, and probably there were Mesopotamians of some kind, people that had been very peaceful and compliant, and therefore could be trusted to inhabit the land.
Richard, was that seen as a reward for those people, or?
I think it would have been a reward for the leadership of those people. Certainly getting, free land is always a good thing. For some of the people on the lower classes and the slaves, and I'll get into that, into slavery in a moment, it probably was not so great a thing. If they were used to living in Mesopotamia, where the land was fairly fertile and irrigation was fairly easy. Parts of Samaria and, well, parts of Galilee are very good, but parts of Samaria were pretty rocky and hilly. So it may not have been to everybody's advantage, but you didn't have a choice. And usually, again, we don't know this for a fact, but it's speculation that probably the Assyrians moved, as I said, compliant or docile people into these territories. They wouldn't take one group of troublemakers and move them into another.
Yeah.
Their idea was probably to spread the troublemakers out as much so they couldn't connect with one another. Well, that's the issue in exile and deportation. When the Babylonians take over, and by the way, I should mention, if I haven't already, the Babylonian Empire is a very short-lived one. It's less than 100 years at its last. And so it's kind of like a blip on the history of Mesopotamia.
Say, Richard, can I ask, were there people that were left behind, or was it, or you think just about everybody was deported, so to speak?
Well,
Uh,
it's hard to tell. We're talking about the Northern Kingdom now, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
because there was, even in Jesus's time, there is still the vestiges of Judaism, Judaism-like kind of faith practice. So I wonder how that persists if people just were completely removed.
yeah, and we don't know. I mean, there are no records about this. The policy was basically once you reached that fourth stage, you burned everything to the ground, and you moved everybody out. The farmers, the laborers, everybody. Um, they may or may not have done that. The people they moved into Galilee and Samaria, which are the basic two territories that had been um, devastated by the Assyrian attack. Um, Apparently, and again, I'll talk about this in a moment, that they were Semitic people, and there may have been some missionary work done by the Judeans in this area, because certainly by the time of Jesus, Galilee was a thoroughly Jewish community. Um, Not so much around the edges of it, but certainly the central valley of Galilee was very Jewish, and it was the center of some of the centers of Jewish learning were there. Um, so something happened, but we're not quite sure what. Samaria is a different story because there um, they developed their own form of Judaism, which is completely different from the both the Jerusalem and the Galilee form. Um, so they're probably, there are always remnants, even when you think you've wiped out all the cities, there probably still were some farmers and people living in caves and people like that who were not affected by the deportation.
Hmm.
Um, so anyway, as I said, the Babylonians take over from the Assyrians, and this happens in a very short time. Um, in 615, the Assyrian Empire is still fairly in good shape. 10 years later, it's gone
Hmm.
completely. It's now under Babylonian control. Nineveh is destroyed. The capital city is destroyed in 612. In 605,
You think there was civil war, or what led to that rapid decline? An ecological
well,
disaster?
we think there was a number of things. Certainly part of it was that even if I said it was intact in 650, there were already signs that it was coming apart at the seams. It was just a little too big to control, and there had been some bad decisions made in terms of economics and in terms of deployment of armies and that kind of thing. So it was already in a bit of trouble, but it had been through that before. And so it was, nothing alarming. But then the Babylonians uh, came on the scene, and in 605, the Battle of Carchemish, and I've wondered about this for years, is it Carchemish or Carchemish? So yesterday I looked it up, and they're both right.
Yeah,
Um,
right. Yeah.
but anyway, that battle is the decisive battle. That is one of the hinges of history,
Hmm.
because at that point, the combined forces of Egypt and Assyria are routed by the Babylonians. Now, the Babylonian king is killed at that point, but his son succeeds him, and his son is named Nebuchadnezzar,
Oh.
and thereby changes a lot of history. Now, I want to make a reference here to something that seems totally irrelevant, but you may remember in reading about the Reformation, especially in northern Germany and in Scandinavia, that basically what happened was they changed the name on the sign of the church.
Hmm.
Instead of St. Teresa's Church, it became St. Teresa's Lutheran Church.
Hmm.
Um, And in many cases, the bishops even stayed on. Well, it was that kind of thing that happened when the Babylonians took over from the Assyrians. The name changed, and a few more documents were done in Babylonian than in Akkadian or Assyrian. But by and large, the structure of the empire pretty much stayed the same.
Right.
And the capital city, however, was moved to Babylon. Because Nineveh and several of the other, Assyria had several capitals during its history, but Nineveh had been pretty much destroyed. So anyway, that brings us to Nebuchadnezzar and the exile. And I've put everything together here in what I hope is a good chronology. I tried to keep it as simple as possible. The one book I'm reading has a chronology that runs for 5 pages.
Yeah.
Okay, we can just go through this chronology very, very simply. 722 is the end of the Northern Kingdom by the Assyrian army. In 626, the what is called the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Let me clarify that. There had been an earlier Babylonian Empire, which didn't last all that long. And so this is called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, sometimes called the Chaldean Empire, because most of the original leaders of it were from the Chaldean people, which is in the very southern end of Mesopotamia. We talked in the Kevin's presentation the last couple of weeks. We talked about Josiah um, and uh, and his reformation, and I'll talk some more about that next week. But Josiah is killed in the Battle of Megiddo in 608. Probably a battle that he had no business being in. It was probably an extremely dumb move on his part, but nevertheless, he is killed. And from there on, the history of Judah sort of goes downhill. 3 years later, you have the Battle of Carchemish, and Nebuchadnezzar becomes the king of Babylon. As I said, after the death of Josiah, things sort of go from bad to, well, from not so bad to pretty bad and then worse in Jerusalem and Judea. And it finally reaches the point where Nebuchadnezzar's general decides that Jerusalem is rather out of control. Remember what I said, the 4 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4? Well, this is kind of like we're into the 3rd step now. And so in 597, there is a siege on Jerusalem, and a number of leaders, including the king, are carried away into exile. And in place of the king, Nebuchadnezzar places the nephew, excuse me, the uncle of the king, um, and so there's one king in Babylon and one Jewish king in Babylon and a Jewish king in Jerusalem. Well, the Jerusalem king is not very bright. And we have lots of records of the prophets warning him that what he is doing is the road to disaster. And he decides to make an alliance with Egypt. This is at a time when Egypt is pretty much declined as a world power. And so at this point, again, Nebuchadnezzar, it's unclear whether Nebuchadnezzar himself is personally involved or it's just his leading general. But anyway, the Babylonians come back, and this time they lay siege, and it's a devastating siege, which leads to, according, if you accept some of the stories, the eating of babies and cannibalism in general, and all kinds of horrible things. And finally, Jerusalem falls, and at this time, again, the Babylonians decide they've had enough of this nonsense, and so they destroy the city. The walls are torn down, the temple is torn down, uh, um, the all the religious practices are banned within the city, or with what's left of the city. And almost all of the leading scholars, intellectuals, teachers of every kind, as well as a large number of craftsmen, weavers and silversmiths and so forth, are all carried off into exile. So the second exile is the far more extreme one. Um, but Nebuchadnezzar places a governor who is again probably not part of the royal house. Um, oh, I should mention what happens to the king in the second exile. A very sad story. He tries to escape and is captured, and in his presence his sons are put to death, and then his eyes are put out, and he is carried off to Babylon. So in his place, Nebuchadnezzar places a governor who is, as I said, probably not royalty, but certainly one of the leading citizens of the country. There is a plot, and it's not quite clear because the few documents we have on it are very contradictory. But there is a plot to assassinate the governor, which is successful. And so this is about 4 or 5 years after the second exile. Along come the Babylonians, and they carry off another bunch of people. And that's the third exile. And so we have a number of people that have been taken into exile in 3 different waves, and probably the second wave was probably a lengthy one. It probably took place over a year or more. So how bad was the exile? Well, we have a book called Lamentations in the Bible. It's sometimes called the Lamentations of Jeremiah, which is a mistake because it comes from a later period. It's probably from the 580s, which is to say, within the generation of people who were carried off into exile. The book is used in Christian liturgy primarily during the Holy Week. And in Jewish liturgy, it is part of the commemoration of the destruction of both the first and the second temples. So let me read to a section from the Book of Lamentations. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night, tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her, they have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations, she finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to her appointed festivals. All her gateways are desolate, her priests groan, her young women grieve, and she is in bitter anguish. That poem was probably written by somebody on the exile path, if you will, on the way to Babylon. We don't know for sure. But in that same book, there is another chapter which includes these verses. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of the Lord's wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. He has made my skin and my flesh grow old and has broken my bones. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He has walled me in so I cannot escape. He has weighed me down with chains. Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has barred my way with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked. I think that gives you some idea of the mood, the religious response, if you will, of some of the people. One final passage from the final chapter of Lamentations. Remember, Lord, what has happened to us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to foreigners. We have become fatherless. Our mothers are widows. We must buy the water we drink. Our wood can be had only at a price. Those who pursue us are at our heels. We are weary and find no rest. Well, this is hardly a picture of cheerfulness and happiness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any response to that?
That's,
Sad.
yeah, those are some of the
Sounds-
most mournful statements I think I've ever
Yeah.
heard.
Desperation.
Yeah, but they still are praying to God, and
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, that is
yeah.
the amazing thing about Lamentations is that even
Right.
though you have this described, there is still a kind of an undercurrent of faith that this may not end badly, that there may be an outcome.
Yeah.
It's great under the circumstances.
Yeah, most of it just throw up our hands. The heck with
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, we've seen what has happened. The city walls were torn down, the temple was torn down, and the religious leadership and other people were carried away. How many people were involved in this? That's one of the questions that's often asked. And the answer is we just don't know. There are, I think, 4 different biblical references to it, but they don't make an awful lot of sense. And there are 2 questions about them: is which of the exiles are they referring to, since there are 3 different exiles? And are we talking about people or are we talking about families? And so, if you're talking about 7,000 families, that's a lot more than 7,000 people. So we have to play the numbers game, and if you object to this, I will sustain your objection. But let's just assume that at this point, uh, the population of the area that stretches all the way from the Sea of Galilee down to Eilat and the Red Sea was about 1 million people. Now, those are not all Jews. I mean, there were a number of other nationalities within that area, but let's say roughly 1 million people. The population of Jerusalem at this time, again, varies greatly, even from year to year. But probably before this whole mess started, at the time of Josiah, probably the population was around 100,000, which means it would have been by far the largest city in that area. The total exiles, and this is a best guess, I mean, it's sort of grabbing a number out of the air, but it's the best guess we can come up with, is that the total exiles in the 3 exiles, now the third one is a very small number, but from the 3 exiles, is probably we're talking about 30,000 people. So what does that mean? Unlike what I think is likely in the Northern Kingdom, where they simply moved everybody out. Here, it looks like the total population, of the total population, probably only about 3% were sent into exile. And probably, since most of the people who were exiled were from Jerusalem, probably 25 to 30% of the population of Jerusalem. So who was deported? Well, the king, obviously, various kings at various times, the royal family. Eventually, they got all of them. uh, exiled. The noble families, of which there were probably several dozen at this point, families that had gained a considerable wealth and prestige either through the temple or through commerce. But the temple leadership would have been singled out and they would have all been taken into exile. Um, the people who were the scribes and the teachers would have been included as well, certainly from Jerusalem. Now, we're not so sure about would this have gone down to the smaller cities as well. It's not at all clear. Nebuchadnezzar seems to have been mostly concerned about Jerusalem because that was where the troublemakers were. And so whether that included some of the other cities, we don't really know. In addition to the intellectual and temple leadership, um, as I said, there were skilled craftsmen who were carried away. Weavers, metalsmiths, architects, builders, and interestingly enough, jewelers. This was simply because one of the objectives of conquering another country was to increase your own wealth, and that meant bringing the people that were potentially builders of wealth into your country. If there were any political leaders, other than the noble families I mentioned, they were probably also carried off unless they were overly hostile, in which case they were probably executed. Who was not deported? Well, again, we don't know much about the smaller towns and cities, but agricultural workers, by and large, were not carried off. They were left there. Common laborers, um, um, probably construction workers who are not skilled, those kind of people. Overseers for both the agriculture and the construction were left. And there was a party of people who were pro-Babylon all along. And the Babylonians were able to identify those. And they were given a choice. You can either come with us to Babylon or you can stay here. And there was kind of a mixed response from that. Well, I think I want to cover one more thing, and then we're not quite to the end of this lecture, but I think we will stop after that. Because one of the questions that comes up in talking about the exile is, did the Jews become slaves?
Hmm.
And we have to take a look at the broader picture of slavery in Assyria and Babylonia, because it's very different from the form of slavery, Negro chattel slavery that developed in both North and South America. Slavery in Assyria, and I'm including Babylonia on this, often had time limits. And there were ways of ending slavery. You could accumulate enough wealth as a slave to buy your way out. And also there were possibilities the owners of slaves would simply let them go free. There were two ways that you could become a slave in Assyria, probably several others, but two major ways. One was if you were captured as the result of a war or a conflict between city-states. It was just very common that if you conquered a neighbor that had been kind of difficult to deal with, you simply made slaves of all their able-bodied men and women, sometimes the children as well. The other way that one could become a slave was through debt or legal punishment. Maybe talk a little bit more about this next week because this is kind of complicated. But let me just give an example of what could happen. Say, for instance, you had a neighbor that had 2 oxen. And during the night, you went into your neighbor's pasture and you stole the oxen and you sold them. And the neighbor finds out and drags you into court. And the court finds you guilty. Well, stealing oxen there's a very easy punishment for that. If you stole 2 oxen, that means you have to give your neighbor 6 oxen. 3 times the number that you stole. That applies to sheep, to goats.
Hmm.
I don't know about chickens, but large stock anyway. So what are you going to do? You owe your neighbor 6 oxen. Well, you don't even have the 2 that you stole, let alone you can't borrow them from neighbors. You can't borrow them, relatives, in-laws, anybody like that. So one way you can resolve that is you go into slavery for a certain number of years, and that would be worked out by the judge and by the plaintiff and the defendant. So I want to mention one thing about inheritance, and this is very, very complicated, so I won't go into it, except to say that if occasionally when a slave was the only adopted son, if you will, of a family, and they died without any other children, it's possible that a slave could even inherit property. And obviously they were no longer a slave once that happened. It's also anyway, it's possible that slavery could be ended in a number of ways, and it might be through a financial transaction, or it might be just through the act of if an owner died, pretty much automatically the slave was set free. I want to mention one quick thing before I end here. There is no racial component to slavery in Assyria. It has nothing to do with either, and we'll see next time, we'll talk a little bit about the racial aspect of this. Race is a linguistic matter. It is not a biological construct. Ken, I think you would agree with me on that.
Absolutely.
And this is very true in Assyria, but even within the different languages, there was no, what should we say, racial distinction made. And so if I use race in the course of these lectures, I am using them as a linguistic category. So anyway, what is the difference between a slave and a free? Very simply, I think there were 2 the differences. One is slaves didn't have a vote. And there were still being votes taken in a lot of local councils and even perhaps on the city-state level. The second thing is that if you were called into court, there is a difference between a free person versus a free person versus a slave, and a slave versus a slave. And the laws, as I say, get very complicated about this. Anyway,
Well, it's an interesting conversation because even in the Gospels, the parables, Jesus refers to people who are slaves as they're just part of the scenery, and they're just characters in most all of the parables, and they're slaves. It says doulos, so in some sense, their lives are not their own, but the fact that we'd make a mistake by over equating it with slavery that we're more familiar with in the United States in our own history, I think is important, but still, I don't think it would be very nice to be a slave. But you think it might be more like indentured servanthood or
Indentured servanthood wasn't great either, but
right. Yeah.
but I think that model of slavery is what continues through most of the ancient world, straight through the Roman Empire.
right.
It really
Right.
isn't the type of slavery we had in the South.
Yeah.
And that's for sure. And I think if you look at some of the parables, like the one we had last Sunday with the one slave being given 5 talents, the other one 2.
Yeah.
What? There was a lot of freedom these guys had.
Yeah.
Then the master went off. I mean, it was just like, well, the slave could, And somewhat surprising, the slave with 5 talents just didn't take the 5 talents and run.
Yeah.
But he
Right.
didn't, so it can't be that bad.
Right. There was a class of slaves that were like managerial
Mhm.
Yeah.
something.
And not only managerial, but also a number of the scribes uh, were slaves.
Mm.
And they may have kept that kind of just as a distinction because they probably could have certainly bought their way out of that. But
I'm
yeah, I think it's very important that this model of slavery, I mean, slavery is never a good thing, but this model of slavery is very, very different from what we saw in the 17th, 18th, 19th century
Yeah.
in
Well,
America. And
I,
like
I,
you say, Ken, it continued into the Greek and Roman world.
Yeah.
I
yes.
tell the story that, um, you know, slavery in the Roman world, you could have whites owning blacks, you could have blacks owning whites, blacks owning blacks, and whites owning whites. It did not have that racial aspect in the sense that we have put on it.
But the sense of the line was probably drawn, as you said, on a foreign nation that lost in war, or a different tribe, or a different family. There were some very distinct lines about who's in and who's out based on tribe or nation rather than skin color, that kind of thing. Um, yeah.
Richard,
So,
you're going to talk later about the Persians and the Medes conquering Babylonia and the end of the exile.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'll be talking about that. That probably comes in the 4th lecture. We actually have made it only. Ken, I know this will come as a real shock to you,
Oh, yeah,
but
right.
we're only partly halfway through the 1st lecture.
Some things never change.
Well, this just doesn't ever change, right?
Yeah.
No, but anyway, so I'm going to continue next time talking about a little bit more on slavery, but mostly talking about, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about race as a linguistic, and sort of cover up or not cover up, to close out the discussion on the kind of the actual events of the exile. Um, and then what I want to talk about mostly next time is what I consider to be the options of the Jews had in the exile, and whether this is um, very basically, I'm talking about the um, other than going off to a cave somewhere or suicide, which I suppose were other options, but just adopting the Mesopotamian religion or some form of it, or abandoning all religion completely, or trying to recover the history of the Jewish people and trying to recover the liturgical aspects of Jewish religion, and then also looking toward redoing or renewing the covenant and putting a new interpretation on that. So that's all stuff that's coming up, and try and get through most of that next week.
all right. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Okay,
That was
thank
great,
you.
Richard.
Yeah.
All
I
right.
really enjoyed it.